At the Texas Agricultural Capital Gala, Sabrina draped her arm over Justin's shoulder. "She's just a charity project," she smirked. I demanded she step back. Justin slapped me violently in front of 400 elite ranchers. I crashed into a heavy crystal decanter. Instead of gasping in shock, the entire room pointed and erupted in cruel laughter, eagerly siding with his smug mistress. I didn't cry. Wiping the blood from my lip, I found only clinical clarity. I pulled out my phone and texted my billionaire mother, Victoria. "Mom, it's time." 10 minutes later, private security breached the ballroom doors. Drop a comment with your location and local time. I'd love to know who is listening. I refused to show weakness. As the private security detail flanked the perimeter of the grand ballroom, the 400 executives and cattle barons fell into a stunned silence. I did not offer them the satisfaction of my tears. I did not beg Justin for an explanation, nor did I wait for Sabrina to drop her smug facade. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I simply stood tall, brushed the shards of crystal from my evening gown, left the ruined table, and sent the single activation message to my mother. The gears of a machine I had kept dormant for a decade were now in motion. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and it was time to audit the ledger. For 10 years, I had made a calculated choice to operate under my mother's maiden name, Morgan. I did not want the multi-billion-dollar shield of Sterling Global Agricultural and Financial Holdings defining my existence. I wanted to build a life predicated on genuine character, exacting labor, and measurable output. I became an independent historic commercial property preservation consultant. It was quiet, methodical work. It required studying structural foundations, analyzing structural integrity, and restoring what time and neglect had damaged. I took pride in evaluating the true worth of a property, stripping away the rot to find the solid beam underneath. I applied the same philosophy to my life, believing that quiet competence always outlasted loud arrogance. Justin operated on the exact opposite principle. As the executive vice president of Crownbridge Capital, his entire identity was a depreciating asset financed by leveraging other people's perceptions. He was obsessed with tailored Italian suits, luxury trucks lifted and polished for pavement rather than dirt, and the empty corporate status that came from loud dinners and expensive watches. I had been the silent investor in his version of a successful life. Now, I realized my affection had been nothing more than a subscription service, with me footing the bill to maintain his bloated valuation. He dismissed my preservation contracts as quaint hobbies, never realizing that those hobbies generated more liquid capital in a month than his inflated salary did in a year. I had allowed him his illusions because I valued peace over being right. But peace was no longer an option. As I walked out of the gala, the cool night air hitting the cut on my lip, I felt my posture correct itself. I was no longer the supportive wife managing his fragile ego. The contract between us had been breached, violently and publicly. There would be no renegotiation. There would be no mediation. The marriage was over, and the hostile takeover had officially begun. I walked to my car with precise, measured steps, my mind already calculating the immediate tactical responses required. I unlocked the door, sat in the driver's seat, and gripped the steering wheel. There was no hesitation. There was no overwhelming tide of grief. The transition from wife to liquidator was instantaneous and absolute. Every toxic choice Justin had made leading up to this exact moment had been logged, categorized, and rigorously evaluated. He had severely miscalculated my net worth, both financially and personally. Now, it was time to issue the final, devastating invoice. To understand the magnitude of his miscalculation, you must audit the sacrifices I had made to protect our marital enterprise. Just 1 month prior, Crownbridge Capital had faced a catastrophic regulatory capital shortfall. Justin's reckless leverage had placed his firm on the brink of federal receivership. He had panicked. I had quietly opened my laptop and wired $400,000 of my private consulting earnings directly into his firm's escrow to save him. I did not ask for equity. I did not ask for public recognition. I simply transferred the capital, acting as the silent underwriter for his failure. This is the psychological trap of normalized devaluation. When you partner with a narcissist, the abuse does not begin with a public strike across the face. It is systemic. It is an algorithmic conditioning where the victim is trained to accept microaggressions until degradation feels like the baseline standard of operations. They strategically bankrupt your confidence. They devalue your contributions, mock your labor, and dismiss your intellect, all while simultaneously siphoning your resources to prop up their hollow empires. You adapt to the daily depreciation of your worth. You adjust your boundaries until they no longer exist, trapped in an illusion that your compliance will eventually yield a profitable return on emotional investment. You absorb the insults. You wire the funds. You silence yourself to keep the structure standing. But endurance is not synonymous with weakness. This is the invisible chain of the survivor. The audience watching a toxic marriage often mistakes patience for submission, failing to recognize it as a highly calibrated survival mechanism. I had been conditioned to endure, meticulously managing risks to avoid an explosive default. I absorbed the pain, internalizing the cost to keep the peace. But survival conditioning has a breaking point. When the final boundary is irrevocably breached, the chain shatters with lethal force. The same immense capacity to endure years of quiet, systemic abuse instantly transmutes into an absolute, unyielding enforcement of perimeters. The slap at the gala was not just a physical assault, it was the catalyst that terminated my survival protocols. The invisible chain snapped. The patience I had deployed to protect him vanished, replaced by an arctic, methodical resolve. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret or sorrow for the end of my marriage, but there was only absolute clarity. I saw the $400,000 not as a gift, but as an unsecured loan that was now in default. I saw his mistresses and his arrogance not as marital problems, but as liabilities that required immediate liquidation. The conditioning was over. The normalization of his cruelty had been permanently revoked. I was no longer operating from a deficit of self-worth or a trauma-bonded dependency. I was operating from a surplus of absolute power and undeniable truth. The foreclosure of Justin's rented, fraudulent life was already in motion, and I would execute the eviction with total precision. While I drove into the darkness, the executives of Crownbridge Capital initiated their own panicked protocols. Back at our sprawling hill country estate, Justin, his father Douglas, and their chief legal counsel Warren acted swiftly to erase my existence. They moved with the frantic urgency of guilty men attempting to hide evidence. They immediately changed the electronic deadbolts, locking me out of the property I had spent years maintaining. They shoved my custom suits and preservation tools into heavy black trash bags, tossing them unceremoniously into the garage. In a final, petty demonstration of his betrayal, Justin left Sabrina's monogrammed silk pocket square draped across the center of the marital bed. It was a calculated territorial claim, a juvenile assertion of power. Simultaneously, the gala descended into chaos. Victoria's security convoy had locked down the venue, their presence paralyzing the executive floor. My mother, operating with the cold efficiency of a corporate titan, demanded a full accounting of the assault from the terrified cattle barons. The men who had laughed at Sabrina's joke now found themselves trapped under the freezing scrutiny of Sterling Global's founder. As Justin's allies panicked at the gala, trying to decipher the sudden influx of elite private security, I utilized the distraction to execute my own retrieval operation. I parked a quarter-mile from the hill country estate and approached the property under the cover of night. They believed changing the digital access codes would neutralize me. They had forgotten that I was a historic property preservationist. I knew the bones of this estate better than I knew the back of my own hand. During my architectural renovation of the property 2 years prior, I had personally restored a reinforced basement coal chute window, integrating a hidden, manual bypass latch for safety compliance. I slipped through the shadows, bypassing the automated security cameras. Reaching the heavy iron grate covering the chute, I triggered the bypass mechanism with practiced precision. The grate swung open silently. I dropped into the dark basement, my evening gown brushing against the cold stone walls. I moved through the silent house with the stealth of a forensic auditor. I didn't care about the trash bags in the garage or the silk pocket square on the bed. I bypassed the sentimental clutter and headed straight for my hidden floor safe. In less than 3 minutes, I secured exactly what I needed: my international passport and my encrypted business hard drive, containing the digital keys to my consulting firm's capital and my true identity. I slipped back down into the basement, intending to exit through the coal chute, but the heavy oak door of the master suite suddenly swung open. The headlights of Justin's luxury truck had swept across the main driveway earlier than I anticipated. They were returning to gloat. I stood up, securing my hard drive, as the men stepped into the room, expecting to find a hysterical, broken woman. Instead, they found me standing amidst the wreckage of our life, holding the keys to their destruction. Justin and Warren swaggered into the master suite, radiating the unearned confidence of men who believed they had already won the war. Seeing me standing by the open safe, Justin's lips curled into a predatory smirk. He signaled to Warren, who pulled a thick, legally binding document from his leather briefcase. It was a retroactive post-nuptial agreement. They moved to trap me, blocking the exit with their broad shoulders, treating my existence as nothing more than a hostile negotiation to be strong-armed into submission. "It's over, Clara," Justin gloated, his voice dripping with condescension. "Sign the post-nup. You walk away with a fraction of your consulting business, and we keep the estate." Warren stepped forward, tapping a gold pen against the postnuptial contract. With a smug, bureaucratic smile, the chief legal counsel revealed their ultimate leverage. They confessed that for the past 18 months, they had been systematically funneling my private consulting earnings into an offshore Cayman trust managed by Warren's wife, Lauren. Justin had quietly exploited the emergency joint signatory access I granted him years ago to bleed my business accounts dry. They had legally isolated my liquid assets, rendering me, they assumed, entirely dependent on their manufactured mercy. They demanded I sign away my marital rights and silence myself in exchange for a nominal, heavily taxed monthly stipend. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I just looked at the thick stack of legal demands. Anger wasn't loud. It was an absolute zero freeze. I reached out, took the post-nuptial agreement from Warren's trembling hand, and deliberately, methodically, tore the legal contract directly down the middle. The sound of ripping paper echoed sharply in the cavernous master suite. Justin lunged forward, his face twisting in rage. But I simply dropped the shredded documents onto Sabrina's silk pocket square on the bed. "You have no idea what you've just done," Warren hissed, his legal composure cracking. "No, Warren," I replied, my voice devoid of any emotional inflection. "You have no idea what you have forged." I watched their confusion mount as I delivered the massive, secondary reality check. This historic hill country estate did not belong to Crownbridge Capital. It had never belonged to Justin. I revealed the lethal truth. The estate itself was secured under a pre-incorporation family land grant belonging exclusively to my mother's ancestral holdings, the Morgan Sterling Trust. When Justin had leveraged the property to inflate his corporate portfolio, he had forged my signature on a quitclaim deed to bypass the bank's title search, unknowingly utilizing stolen collateral. By attempting to force me to sign a retroactive post-nuptial agreement to formally claim ownership of the land, Warren had just committed documented, irrefutable, federal title forgery. They hadn't brilliantly outmaneuvered a naive, compliant wife. They had brazenly defrauded a ruthless, multi-billion-dollar corporate entity. The color drained from Justin's face as the architectural permanence of his failure finally registered. He had built his entire kingdom on land he was quietly trespassing on. The Cayman Trust was irrelevant. I owned the ground beneath his feet. I bypassed them both, stepping over the shredded remains of their legal leverage, and walked out of the master suite without a backward glance. The trap had been set, but I wasn't the prey. I was the executioner, and the paperwork for their complete financial demise was already finalized. At 9 o'clock the following morning, the crisp Austin sunlight reflected off the towering glass facade of Sterling Global Holdings. Douglas, Justin, and Warren marched onto the 60th floor, their footsteps echoing with the manufactured confidence of corporate conquerors. They were arriving at the Obsidian boardroom expecting to finalize $150 million in emergency private equity to bail out Crownbridge Capital. They believed they were about to shake hands with faceless billionaires and secure the lifeline their fraudulent empire desperately required. The heavy double doors swung open. They froze. I was seated in the high-backed leather executive chair at the head of the massive obsidian table. I was not wearing an evening gown or a compliant smile. I was flanked by a team of elite forensic accountants, Sterling Global's senior corporate litigators, and two grim-faced federal investigators. Douglas stumbled backward, his briefcase slipping from his grip. Justin's eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for the wealthy benefactors he had been promised, unable to comprehend the visual data in front of him. They were not shocked by what they had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. This is the illusion of power in a hollow wallet. When an individual's entire social standing, identity, and authority are constructed upon rented leverage and stolen capital, their psychology is fundamentally, irreparably brittle. They strut through the corporate world demanding unwavering respect, projecting an aura of unassailable invincibility, but they are entirely dependent on the continuous influx of other people's money. They don't actually own their power. They lease it at exorbitant, fraudulent interest rates. When you freeze their accounts and cut off the stolen capital, the collapse is instantaneous and spectacular. Without the protective barrier of borrowed millions, the narcissist is instantly reduced to their actual net worth, zero. Their arrogance shatters, revealing nothing but profound, pathetic panic. Justin and his conspirators were currently experiencing this psychological freefall in real time. The borrowed leverage that had sustained their arrogance had evaporated the second they walked into my boardroom. Warren, the supposed legal mastermind, began hyperventilating, realizing the federal investigators present were not there for a standard compliance audit. Douglas gripped the back of a chair, his face turning an unhealthy shade of ashen gray. "Clara, what is this?" Justin choked out, the booming voice of the executive vice president reduced to a trembling whisper. "Where are the investors?" "I am the investor, Justin," I stated, my voice echoing like ice cracking in a silent room. "I am the majority shareholder and executive vice president of acquisitions for Sterling Global Holdings, and we are currently reviewing your portfolio." There was no negotiation. There was no mediation. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. They had walked into the apex predator's den expecting a bailout, totally oblivious to the fact that they were the primary items on the liquidation menu. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the polished black stone, flanked by the instruments of their destruction, and prepared to issue the final, uncompromising verdict on their rented lives. I opened the thick, leather-bound forensic audit file on the table before me. The silence in the obsidian boardroom was absolute, broken only by the sharp rustle of the turning pages. I did not raise my voice. I did not express anger. I simply read out their financial death sentence with methodical, surgical precision. Over the past 36 months, I began, my eyes locking onto Douglas. Crownbridge Capital has engaged in systematic federal wire fraud. In order to artificially inflate your liquidity and qualify for our $150 million private equity bailout, you executed unauthorized transfers. You commingled and looted vulnerable elderly client escrow accounts. You drained municipal teacher pension funds. You cannibalized the life savings of the hardworking people who explicitly trusted you, all to maintain the illusion of your own corporate solvency. Warren let out a strangled sob, collapsing into one of the plush chairs. He knew the federal investigators standing beside me had already secured the transaction logs from the encrypted hard drive I had extracted from the coal chute. As the executive vice president of acquisitions, I continued closing the file. "I am permanently denying your $150 million capital injection. Sterling Global will not finance a criminal enterprise." The denial was the kill switch. Without the emergency funding, Crownbridge Capital was mathematically and functionally dead. By denying the injection, I triggered their immediate, unavoidable Chapter 11 bankruptcy collapse. Their stock options were instantly void. Their corporate credit lines were permanently frozen. Justin fell to his knees on the imported rug. The tailored Italian suit he prized so highly bunched around his legs as he crawled toward the edge of the obsidian table. "Clara, please," he begged, tears streaming down his face, his voice cracking with genuine terror. "You can't do this. I'm your husband. I'll lose everything. They'll put us in prison." "I'd been the silent investor in your version of family, Justin," I replied, staring down at him with glacial detachment. Now I realize it had been a subscription, with me footing the bill. "Your subscription has been canceled." I delivered the final, calculated blow. I handed him a thick stack of divorce filings alongside a comprehensive civil lawsuit that would immediately freeze whatever pennies he had left. I formally stripped him of all access to the Hill Country estate, transferring the title back to the Morgan Sterling Trust. I had already filed the court orders to seize his entire luxury vehicle collection as collateral against the $400,000 personal loan I had wired him the month prior. Finally, because Justin had arrogantly signed personal guarantees on Crownbridge Capital's highly toxic real estate debt, I was now the sole creditor, holding his literal, unpayable financial ruin. "This wasn't a breakdown," I whispered, sliding the documents across the polished stone. "It was a balance sheet." I nodded to the security personnel. Two heavily armed guards stepped forward, hauling Justin off his knees and dragging him toward the heavy double doors. Douglas and Warren were pulled to their feet by the grim-faced agents. Security unceremoniously ejected the disgraced, weeping executives from the boardroom as the FBI agents moved in to officially execute the federal warrants. The slate was wiped clean. The debt was settled. 6 months later, the financial and social fallout of the Cross family was absolute and undeniable. Justin now works a grueling minimum wage job, wearing a bright orange vest at a local hardware store, his luxury trucks repossessed, and his corporate identity erased. Warren faces multiple federal indictments and permanent legal disbarment. Sabrina and Lauren, stripped of their offshore Cayman trusts and seized luxury goods, live in a cramped, humid apartment on the outskirts of the city. I stood on the sunlit stone steps of a fully restored Victorian mansion in the historic district. This property was no longer a silent symbol of inherited wealth. It was now operating as the Morgan Sterling Foundation for survivors of domestic and financial abuse. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from my mother, Victoria. "The foundation is solid." I looked out over the crowd of supporters, advocates, and survivors gathering on the lawn. This is the justice of the sower. True justice is not merely the destruction of the wicked. It is the deliberate cultivation of a permanent legacy of protection. Revenge burns everything to the ground, but structural healing plants seeds in the ashes. By redirecting the stolen capital that was meant to exploit into an institution that actively empowers, the narrative is permanently elevated from mere personal retribution to structural healing and community creation. We ensure that the predators are starved of power, while the vulnerable are heavily fortified. They weren't shocked by what they'd done, but they were shocked that I had stopped playing along and started building instead. I've come to realize that surviving abuse isn't just about escaping the fire. It's about claiming the ground where the fire burned and building a fortress over it. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the absolute severing of toxic ties that becomes the only way to set yourself free. I had been the silent investor in their cruelty, but I am now the sole proprietor of my peace. If this story reminded you that your boundaries are your armor, drop a like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Remember, never shrink your light to fit a room that was never built to hold you. See you in the next story.